So really, the reason we fight is to continue to give our members as smaller providers an opportunity to compete in the marketplace and to at least be one competitive voice in that market.
Welcome to episode 202 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I'm Lisa Gonzalez. It's common knowledge that big corporate internet service providers such as Comcast, CenturyLink, and AT&T have armies of lobbyists meeting the state and federal officials every day. But what do smaller local providers do when they anticipate an impact on their business due to proposed legislation, new rules, or changes in regulations? They join forces to make their opinions heard. Today, Chris shares his conversation with Matt Polka, President and CEO of the American Cable Association. The ACA represents cable, phone, and fiber-to-the-home operators and municipalities who describe themselves as small and medium-sized independent operators. These entities are vital in bringing service to smaller markets and rural areas. Check out their website at americancable.org. Here are Chris and Matt discussing the organization, some of the members' policy goals, and a few of the pros and cons of working as a smaller provider in today's market.
Welcome to another edition of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Chris Mitchell. Today I'm speaking with Matt Polka, the President and CEO of the American Cable Association. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here with you today.
Well, I was excited to run into you in Iowa for the Iowa Association of Municipal Utility Conference. I always meet great people down there, and I've long known about the ACA, but I wasn't sure if all of the people who listen to this show have heard of it. So why don't you tell us what the ACA is?
Sure, and thanks again for having me today. And not a surprise that you and I met at the IAMU event not too long ago. Because within the American Cable Association, we do have quite a few municipal members. The American Cable Association has approximately 800 smaller companies, smaller independent broadband, phone, and video providers. We're in all 50 states. Our 850 members represent about 7.5 million video subscribers. Within our membership, we have, of those 800 companies or so, 40% of our companies are traditional telephone-based companies, and we have more than 100 municipally-based entities as well that provide voice, video, and broadband in their marketplaces. Within our ACA membership of 800 companies, 80% of our companies have 5,000 subscribers or fewer, and half of our members have 1,000 customers or fewer. So we're talking about very, very small entities that are providing voice, video, and broadband, primarily in small markets, rural areas, and in a number of competitive situations where our members take on the big guys, Comcast, DirecTV, Verizon, AT&T, UVerse, et cetera.
One of the things that I found interesting about ACA is that you're headquartered in Pittsburgh. I'm originally a Pennsylvania boy myself, although on the other side of the state. But I love a trade association that is not located within Washington, D.C. I have a strong bias. I don't hide it too much. But you all must do things other than just lobbying the federal government.
We were founded as a volunteer organization back in 1993, a year after Congress had re-regulated the cable industry, the entire cable industry, and the FCC had imposed significant regulations upon all cable providers. I was general counsel of a small cable company at the time, a company called Star Cable Associates, and my company, along with about 150 other smaller companies, got together and said, look, the big companies that were sort of representing our interests as an association in Washington, they weren't really focused on the unique concerns of independent providers in small markets and rural areas. So right then and there, we created an association at that time called the Small Cable Business Association. We worked as a volunteer organization for 4 years, and then after 4 years, our board, and I was a member of the board at the time, we said, look, Washington is a full-time job. We have to be thinking about our work on a full-time basis, so let's go hire someone to run the association. And after looking around for a while, the board came back to me and said, well, you're a cable guy, you're a lawyer, you've been working in Washington here for us for 4 years, would you do it? And I said I'd be happy to do it, but I had small kids at the time and didn't want to move from Pittsburgh, plus we didn't have any money. So we stayed in Pittsburgh, and we've been there ever since, although we have quite a few folks that help us in Washington. But I think it does represent who we are as an association, that our members, while we work in Washington on policy matters before Congress, the FCC, and other agencies, we're not based there. And our members are out in their marketplaces day in and day out providing service. So it's kind of nice to be outside of the Beltway and for all that it suggests.
Your membership includes a number of small companies. I mean, obviously, a lot of small private companies. Some of them I know, some of them are supportive of municipalities choosing to get into this, and others aren't. So how does the trade association kind of deal with that tension between the private and the public models?
One way we deal with the issues among our members is communicate. We spend a lot of time with our municipal groups, our municipal members, our telco members, our cable members, and within our board, within various events that we do, where we're sharing about what our members' interests are and what they want to accomplish from a policy perspective. From a 35,000 foot level, when we look at our policy, virtually all that we do from a standpoint of ensuring our members' competitiveness, particularly around video issues, which they all share in dealing with purchasing video content from the 4 or 5 largest owners of content that are out there. Our members are in alignment. I mean, all of our members today are trying to provide greater choice to consumers, whether through skinny bundles, lower priced tiers, even a la carte, as well as maximizing their broadband plan to give consumers more choice over it, whether through Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, etc. From a standpoint of many of the competitive issues that exist, private versus public, between what you might consider to be our more typical cable members versus our more public-oriented municipal members, it hasn't been a major issue within our group. One of the things that we have tried not to do is to interfere or get involved with issues of municipalities and their organizations as they have sought greater funding. Although I will say that the one issue that we've been pretty consistent about advocating on that score over time has been the fact that we believe in general that funding, taxpayer funding in general, should be used to help support broadband where it primarily does not exist today, rather than in areas where it's already been built by private capital. So at times, there is some tension, but not as much as you would think, because again of the way we've tried to communicate with members, share in general our views, and work together on this and many other issues.
Well, let's talk about some of those shared interests, because that's one of the things that the Institute for Local Self-Reliance really focuses on at scale. And I definitely agree that I think small privately owned cable companies have so much in common with municipal companies when we talk about the difference between those small actors and the huge corporations. So let me ask you a leading question, which is, why should we care about small providers? Isn't bigger better? Shouldn't we be excited about bigger companies that are forming from these consolidation in the industry?
Well, that's the theory, and that's oftentimes what people in Washington think, simply because the interests of larger companies, whether it's multi-video programming distributors like Comcast, Fios, Dish, and DirecTV, or the big content providers, whether it's Comcast, NBC Universal, Fox News Corp, etc., Disney, ABC, ESPN. But the truth of the matter is that without smaller providers and the members that we represent and others that exist in the marketplace, there really wouldn't be those competitors in smaller markets, rural areas, and those that choose to compete against the large companies. The fact of the matter is that the largest companies in the multi-video programming space, Comcast, Charter, Time Warner, Cox, etc., they have built businesses that are largely moving away from, if not already moved away from, small markets, rural areas, because there's just simply not enough density. In fact, many of our member companies today that exist because they have purchased systems at the end of the line from some of the larger providers in areas in small towns where these larger companies did not want to serve. For our members, that's their Times Square. That's their Midtown Manhattan. Those are the big markets that they choose to serve and also to live in, which is pretty common where you find our members living and working in their communities. So it's vitally important for these small companies to exist, whether municipal, telco, cable, because if they're not there, then chances are these smaller communities, which have every right to have broadband, just like Midtown Manhattan, may not get broadband like they desire. So that's why we fight for these smaller interests.
And what is the impact on the smaller interests when there's these mergers? I mean, we certainly joined you in opposing the Comcast Time Warner Cable merger. We won on that, and now we're seeing that Time Warner Cable is just merging with Charter. So, what is the impact of consolidation on smaller cable companies that you represent?
It has a significant impact on potential competition and ensuring that there is competition to the large, mega merged interest. A lot of our fight over the years, whether it's been Charter Time Warner, AT&T DirecTV, Comcast Time Warner Cable, and other mergers down the line, Fox News Corp Liberty, has been focused on control of content. When there are mergers of this type, where you have the combination of essentially distribution providers, companies that own cable operations, coupled with other related interests that own programming that a cable operator provides to its customers, there's an incentive to be anti-competitive. And basically it works like this. If one of our members is in a market with one of these mega merged entities, and we have to buy programming from them, whether cable programming, sports programming, or even in some cases broadcast programming with retransmission consent. There is an incentive for the merged entity to either want to jack up the price, raise the price to its competitor so that its competitor has to pay a higher price for the same content, or to insert onerous terms and provisions in a programming contract that make it less attractive to do a deal. And consequently, over the years, with some success, although unfortunately the FCC more recently has been less likely to impose such conditions, we have sought conditions through the FCC to basically require that programming content has to be made available to competitors to the merged entities on fair and reasonable terms. And if it's not provided on fair and reasonable terms, to have a right to arbitrate. That certainly was the case in the merger of Comcast and NBC Universal that was back about 6 or 7 years ago, 2010, 2011. More recently, however, we've been pretty disappointed to see that the FCC did not impose such conditions on AT&T's acquisition of DirecTV, where there is control of important regional sports programming. And while the order is still pending, we don't see this happening to any significant degree, at least as it relates to current multi-video programming distributors, to see any kind of programming conditions in the Charter Time Warner condition. Although there do seem to be some conditions as it relates to making programming available to online video distributors. That's fine, but by the same token, there will be a number of companies, small companies that are wireline companies today that will compete against Charter Time Warner, who may not have the benefit of the same conditions, and we think that's a problem.
Let me ask you what that actually means in terms of the bottom line of these cable companies. I mean, I think a lot of people assume that the cable industry, we talk about often about the massive profits of Comcast and these other guys. Even if the costs are a little bit higher for the smaller guys, are you still making out like bandits?
Quite the contrary, which usually is the case. And the reason for that on the wholesale side of the business, our members are, the smallest providers that are negotiating with a Comcast, NBC Universal, or, what will be a Charter Time Warner or a Disney ABC, and there's just simply very little scale to try to negotiate any lower volume-based price, and consequently, because of that fact, as well as the practices of these larger content providers, and their practices, as consumers well know, is to bundle their programming. So to obtain one important popular channel, you need to also take and pay for 8, 9, 10 or more channels from the same programming owner, whether people watch those channels or not. And most times consumers aren't watching those programming.
You wouldn't expect a content owner to force content on you that you would actually want, right? I mean, that's the whole point of them forcing it on you.
Yeah, and I mean, it's basically like a monthly annuity that they receive from consumers through their video providers, cable companies, satellite providers, et cetera, that just goes back upstream to the big content owner, who gets paid for their programming whether a consumer watches it or not. And part of the reason why the large content companies like this bundled practice, which we do not like and are trying to break up, is because they have made other deals upstream to sports leagues, to studios in Hollywood, for other original programming. They've agreed to pay. So they have to pay people upstream, and they just come to us and they come to our consumers to basically say, if you want the popular channel, you have to take all of this other stuff, whether you like it or not, and that helps them to pay for other programming. And the fact of the matter is that we're at a point today where the bundle is just not affordable, and that's why many of our members today are trying to provide more choices through slimmer bundles, to give their consumers more choices through broadband, to try to sell consumers more of a Lifeline basic level of service along with broadband. But ironically enough, while you think that might be something that consumers would like, which they do, we can't really give as much of that programming to our consumers as we like because of the way the large content companies restrict carriage. We can only provide services like that to only a certain percentage, a small percentage of our marketplace, or else if we go over a certain percentage, then we're oftentimes forced to pay a penalty, and it's expensive. So we would like to give consumers more choice, but these big content companies that control the content don't like to give it.
Well, that's actually, I think, a really good point that I'd like to ask you one follow-up question on. And I wanted to say, I think Senator McCain's been one of the leaders in terms of trying to make the industry work better for folks like you. Is that right?
Absolutely. Both Senator McCain and also Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut have been champions here. Senator McCain introduced a bill that would require more a la carte carriage of programming services, and Senator Blumenthal was a co-sponsor of this. We've supported those efforts. We want to see consumers have the ability to obtain programming, whether through slimmer bundles or even on an a la carte basis for expensive channels. But to date, he hasn't been able to garner a whole lot of support of his colleagues. And the companies that own content have really pushed back hard. They don't want choice.
That's one of the things that I've found amazing is just despite this is one of those issues in which I think, 90% of the country broadly agrees on in terms of, nobody wants to see the cable companies and the big content owners have more power. And in fact, I would say, and I'm curious to what extent you would agree, I think it's a little bit schizophrenic for the federal government to pretend that its national policy is one of encouraging competition, when in fact it allows a market structure in which Comcast and the biggest cable companies can ensure that they're paying, just 75% or less in some cases of what their competitors are paying, because they get such an incredible discount on the content. I mean, we've dealt with this in the past through robust federal legislation that restricted market power, but we don't see any real effort like that in the country. It's a hobby horse that I sort of beat every now and then, so I'm sorry to lay all that on you.
No. It's something that we've been fighting as smaller independent providers for the entirety of our existence. And it comes down to small versus large, consumer versus consolidated media conglomerate, and it has been a difficult issue to address. And I think the answer to your question on why it has been difficult is, while on one hand there certainly is, and we agree with this, the desire, as we fight in our industry to try to give our customers more choices, what has I think been a bit of a barrier for the federal government to act, more directly on these issues is just the notion of ownership of your intellectual property, and that to some degree the Congress and the FCC, it's not really their role to intervene in a contract relationship between someone that owns their own intellectual property and how they want to sell it. That's where some of the arguments certainly have been by the larger companies who say, hey, this is my programming content. It's not up to the federal government to tell me how I'm allowed to sell it. Historically, I think there is some legitimacy to that. But on the other hand, as we've argued, at what price to consumers? Even Brian Roberts, not long ago, several months ago, I remember seeing a headline where, with his Comcast hat on, said, we can't reasonably continue to charge consumers what we're charging them for the bundle. It is just at a point now where, it really is an economic issue if you live in a small community where, you're spending a couple of $100 a month on your cable bill or your satellite bill. And that's why consumers are demanding more choice. We're on the video side. We certainly are working feverishly to renegotiate our programming agreements as they come up to try to give our members more choice, to create slimmer bundles and bundles that are appropriate for the community. But at the same time, I think what's really making the most change is our members' ability to provide our customers with the best, fastest, highest capacity broadband service that we can, because consumers themselves are finding ways to develop greater habits through video choice, and that's what we want to give them. While the market, the video market, and certainly the larger programmers are not fighting over themselves to try to give consumers more choice, they don't want choice. The availability of broadband to consumers is empowering consumers to find that choice, and that's what our members are trying to give to our customers.
Just to put a bow around this, this is an issue that the federal government has had to deal with for a long time. And I agree with you. I don't think we want to just see the federal government just arbitrarily sort of remaking markets and that sort of thing. But there is a long history, and I think in particular dealing with bookstores and other kinds of retail, in terms of how wholesalers are regulated and things like that, to try and prevent the kind of deformed market structure that we have today. But I want to, as we're running out of time, I want to make sure we touch on something that I think is very important to me, and I know that it's important to you, and that's how federal regulations, whether it's from the FCC or elsewhere, how they fall differently on small providers than on the larger providers.
It goes to why we exist as an association to represent these smaller entities in these areas. We basically have fewer customers per mile compared to the larger providers in major cities. Regulations typically have the same cost per mile regardless of whether you're Time Warner Cable in New York City or one of our members in a small rural community. If you have fewer customers per mile, you have a higher cost of regulation per customer and a longer return on investment. And basically, the impact of regulation at times can be disproportionate on smaller companies. One of the things that we try to do is balance that regulatory impact out for our members through our advocacy efforts, which oftentimes would mean a longer transition towards compliance. In some cases, based on financial hardship, maybe a waiver or an exemption. But to try to encourage the federal government to understand that one size regulation does not always work, particularly on smaller companies who are trying to provide the best in broadband, phone, and video service in smaller markets, but have unique circumstances compared to Comcast, AT&T, Dish, and DirecTV. So really the reason we fight is to continue to give our members as smaller providers an opportunity to compete in the marketplace and to at least be one competitive voice in that market. Hopefully they can continue and be viable entities that can at least provide a robust wireline service for phone, video, and broadband.
I was just speaking with a small public utility district out in Washington State, and they were talking about, in particular, the questions that they had to answer on the special access proceeding, which is a proceeding that, frankly, I'm supportive of, and I think there's significant problems in that market. But I understand through talking with them that just the FCC's, the questions that they asked every operator to answer didn't make sense for a lot of small providers. Does that sort of scenario, does that come from just people at the FCC having a mindset of who they're dealing with, or what kind of causes those sorts of things to happen?
Well, I think it's sort of a lack of focus on the impact of regulation on smaller markets and smaller providers. I mean, the FCC's efforts, whether it's, you look at Title II or you look at the set-top box rulemaking or special access, in my view, are targeted more to address what they consider to be anti-competitive concerns of larger MVPDs, Comcast, and others.
Or in the case of special access, even I would say primarily telephone companies, 2 of them, 3 of them maybe, but certainly not 100 of them.
Exactly. And where I think the FCC can do better for consumers in these smaller markets is to recognize through its rulemaking processes that more time needs to be taken to determine the impact of its regulations on smaller providers that frankly didn't cause the problems that they're trying to address. Typically, the FCC will, at least in a cursory way, look at the impact of its regulations on smaller providers, smaller communities. But at the end of the day, it pretty much ends up to be a one size fits all. And frankly, it just comes back to our point of view, which is, look, we understand that we live and work in a regulated environment, and we're okay with that. But we would like our regulators to just be mindful of the fact that we're not all AT&T, or we're not all Comcast, or we're not all DirecTV, and we need to be treated differently in some of these smaller markets because it makes a difference. If regulations at the end of the day force a small entity to cease doing business because it can't afford the regulatory impact, and that competitor is lost in a smaller market, then that's not good public policy. And so we're trying to balance the need to act in what is a regulated environment with the impact on competition in smaller markets.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to tell us more about the American Cable Association, Matt, and especially for helping us to better understand, I think, the differences between small businesses and massive global entities.
Happy to do it, and great to talk with you today, and look forward to talking with and working with you soon.
Sounds good.
That was Chris and Matt Polka, President and CEO of the American Cable Association. Remember, you can access the transcript for this and other Community Broadband Bits podcasts at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Send us your ideas for the show. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. You can also follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter, where the handle is @muninetworks.org. Thank you to the group Forget the Whale for their song, I Know Where You've Been, licensed through Creative Commons. And thanks for listening to episode 202 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast.